Um, Hello, we'll just test the volume. Can people hear at the back? Is the volume okay? Right. Closer. That's better, right. It's on, yeah, it is on. Right, good morning, everybody. And first, I'd like, on behalf of the British Society of Master Glass Painters, I'd like to thank St. Peter's Frimley for welcoming us here this morning and for providing coffee, which is very nice. My name is Peter Cormack. I'm one of the vice presidents of the Society. And this is the first stop on our annual conference, where we're going to visit a number of local churches. We started with Frimley, and this church, as those of you who have the notes will know, is a church from the early 19th century. So what we're looking at, apart from the West End and the East End, which were designed in the 1880s, the main body of the church is from the early 19th century. Hence, you have the cast iron columns supporting the galleries. Later in the 19th century, galleries became very unfashionable. So this is actually a rather interesting survival from that period. And the architect was James Thompson Parkinson, who generally worked in London, was a property developer, really, as well as an architect. And subsequently, the local architect, Thomas Goodchild, was responsible for extending the church at the West and the East End. Our principal interest is in the stained glass windows. The first one, the east window, was designed by John William Brown, J.W. Brown, of the firm of James Powell and Sons. And what makes St. Peter's very unusual is that, with one exception, every single stained glass window in this church is by the same firm, James Powell and Sons of Whitefriars in the City of London. The one exception is the west window of the Ascension of Christ, which is by Meyer and Co. of London and Munich. It's actually a German firm. Their windows were made in Germany, but imported and sold in Britain. But a vast amount of their work was made, was both made and used in Germany and exported also to America and other places. Meyer was one of the biggest the biggest of the German stained glass firms, which had started in the early 19th century. Powell's were probably the major London stained glass firm, and also probably the most progressive. They employed a number of very well-known artists, including Edward Burne-Jones in their early years, and really that tradition of working with progressive artists, including members of the Pre-Raphaelite circle, goes on into the 19th century with John William Brown, who designed the east window. J.W. Brown had actually worked in the Morris Burne-Jones studios. He'd been trained in Newcastle and at the Government School of Design, which had been set up in Newcastle in the early 19th century. And there he was trained by William Bell Scott, a well-known Pre-Raphaelite poet and painter. And it was Bell Scott who recommended Brown to the firm of Morris and Company in London. And he worked as a glass painter for Morris before then becoming a designer for Powell's. So we have a complete set of Powell windows, with the exception of the Meyer West window here. And I can't think actually of any other church which has such an extensive scheme, or smallish parish church, which has such an extensive scheme of Powell's windows. Now, stained glass, as you know, is very much a product of the Gothic revival, But the windows here, although they have Gothic elements, particularly in the canopy work, the framing that surrounds the windows, the style of the figure drawing in the windows reflects very much more that pre-Raphaelite and aesthetic movement idiom of the 1860s, 1870s, and 1880s. The best known of the artists who contributed designs here, apart from J.W. Brown, but by far the most well-known, was Henry Holiday. And there are several windows by Holiday. These two here, the one of Christ in Gethsemane, the one with Christ blessing children, this one here of the three Marys and the resurrected Christ here. Now, these were reuses of cartoons that Henry Holiday had designed earlier, and for example, those two feature in the windows at St. Mary Magdalene's, Paddington, a well-known scheme of windows by Henry Holiday from the late 1860s. And on this side, the first two windows are also from the cartoons, i.e. the full-size drawings by Henry Holiday. If I'm prepared to bet £10 to anybody who can tell me the connection between the furthest most window, on the right there, between that and Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. And I'll give you £10 if you can tell me what it is, but I don't think you will. That's a pretty safe bet. But the rest of the windows, there's Henry Holiday and various other designers for James Powell and Sons, who designed some of the upper windows in the gallery level. Charles Hardgrave designed, for example, the window of the two crowned saints there. Some of you won't be able to see them at the moment. And Harry Ellis Wooldridge designed the window up here, which those of you on that side will be able to see. Now, Wooldridge is a very interesting figure. He had worked with Henry Holiday as one of his assistants, and had also worked with Burne-Jones. So we're talking about artists who are very much part of the wider pre-Raphaelite circle. Wooldridge then succeeded John Ruskin as the Slade Professor of Art at Oxford University. So he was a very distinguished artist and a scholar as well. But most interesting is that he was also one of the pioneers of the early music revival in this country. And he was the author of the first volume of the Oxford History of Music. And Wooldridge spent a lot of his time looking through libraries and archives at the work of Monteverdi and Palestrina and others, and contributed that first volume to the Oxford History of Music. So he's both a distinguished artist and a musicologist. He was a painter as well as a designer of stained glass windows. Now, those of you who don't, I think the members of the British Society of Master Glass Painters will all be familiar with the techniques of stained glass. But for those of you who are not familiar with it, essentially all these windows, which date from the 1880s and 1890s, in their technique are identical to the stained glass windows made in the 14th or the 15th century. So the technique was revived in the early 19th century. The colored glass you see is colored all the way through, just like a beer bottle or a wine bottle. And the detail that's added for the faces and the lines of drapery, etc., are painted not with a color, but with a monochrome brownish black pigment, which is painted on as either lines or as shading. It's fired into the glass to make it permanent. It fuses permanently into the glass. And then the pieces of colored glass are assembled like a large sort of jigsaw puzzle and fitted into the grooved lead which holds the window together. The windows are usually made in panels. These are relatively small. You can see very clearly that the windows along the side there are made as a single large panel, and then a smaller panel for the ventilator at the top, the section that, as you can see, one of them is open there, so you can quite clearly see it's a separate section. The iron bars that go across support the window because of wind pressure, etc., and they strengthen the structure of the window. The colors used, James Powell & Sons, who made these windows, all but the Meyer window at the West End, the colors were actually manufactured by James Powell & Sons. They were the only firm that made their own raw material as well as making windows. So Whitefriars Glass was also very well known for making tableware. So you could buy wine glasses or decanters, etc., made by the same firm. And if you go on the internet and look up Whitefriars Glass, the chances are that what you will see will be very beautiful antique collectible glass that you could have in your home. But they were also making a large amount of stained glass for colored glass for windows, and actually manufacturing the windows themselves, as in these windows here. Henry Holliday was their chief designer from the later 1860s through to 1890. From 1890, this man, J.W. Brown, took over as their principal designer, and it was Brown who did the initial large windows for Liverpool Anglican Cathedral. I mentioned Liverpool Anglican Cathedral because of the link between that window, that first window in the aisle there. It illustrates the story from the New Testament of St. Paul preaching in Athens. And it has that famous text, which if you know the King James Bible, it's, "Whom therefore ye ignorantly worship, him declare I unto you." It's a wonderful word order. It's St. Paul to the Athenians who worshipped an unknown god. They worshipped loads and loads of gods, and they thought just to be on the safe side, they'd have an unknown god as well. And St. Paul came along and said, well, the one that you don't know anything about is the God of Jesus Christ. So that's the scene that is illustrated there. And there are other scenes from the Acts of the Apostles that are illustrated in the windows. And indeed, there's a whole sequence that, starting here with the life of Christ and the Passion, etc. Unless somebody has guessed the £10 bet, I'll put you out of your misery. You'll see that St. Paul is on the right there with a red thing and a bluish cloak over the top. And there's a woman in the foreground. The model for that woman was Ellen Scott, who was the mother of Sir Giles Gilbert Scott, who was the architect of Liverpool Cathedral. So I was rather stretching it. You can see why I was pretty confident I was going to keep my £10. Anyway, it is a magnificent series of windows, and I think it's unusual. What would be interesting to know, and I don't know, is how this church, St. Peter's Frimley, was able to ensure that all its windows, with the exception of that early one by Meyer from 1883, all of them were made by the same firm of James Powell & Sons. It suggests to me either that the vicar at the time insisted that anybody who wanted to give a window to the church had to go to Powell's, or else that the parochial church council decided that they would have a consistent set of windows, all designed. Yes, obviously it was contacts, but what it means is that instead of, as so often one finds in a parish church, lots of different windows in very different styles, what you have here is a complete sort of suite designed by different artists, but all made in a very similar idiom with similar coloring, etc. And it makes the most effective set, I think, of windows. And that's really quite unusual. So it's a distinction that St. Peter's has. The windows in the gallery obviously are on a larger scale with individual figures of saints and Old Testament figures. The evangelists are here, St. Matthew and Mark, and Luke and John are there, but the rest of them are figures mainly from the Old Testament, in fact. So it's a combination of the Old Testament and then scenes from the New Testament in the lower, smaller windows. So, well, anyway, now an opportunity to have a look at the windows themselves. If anybody's got any questions, do feel free to ask any questions.